Yeah, let's get started, and I'll work on it in the background. Okay, so go ready. Okay, gentlemen. Oh, hello. Let's get started. Sorry. Hello. Can you put that agenda there? Okay, so welcome to OAUTH work group second session. Remember that we still under the note well, so if you haven't seen that, please remember that we will be just maybe present that. That's the note well here. Next, let's go to the. So we have a Jabber, a Scrub, a Mini Taker. Thank you to Justin and Mr. Netherland. Thank you. And yeah, Tony. Sorry. Yeah. Next. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Let's go to the agenda. Right. We talked about all this, just agenda. Okay. Okay. So Mike will have two drafts to talk about today. Omer will later join us remotely to talk about that. His new idea for a client session flow. We will have a distributed auth discussion. So we have maybe 2 slides and kind of a discussion. And Torsten had one more document that he wants to discuss. This is something that he just submitted a few days ago. And we have yet another draft that we want to allocate maybe 5 to 10 minutes. So we probably take those 5 to 10 minutes from the distributed auth, and we might switch that a little bit. Maybe we can take this to the end and just take the rest of that time for the distributed auth discussion. So something that we can kind of shuffle it if we need.
We will manage time.
Yeah, okay.
I think I'll give you 15 minutes back.
Awesome. So, Mike, the floor is yours. Thanks.
First, let's talk about the OAuth authorization server metadata draft, which the group of us have been working on for a while. It has completed the next. Since Singapore, we've done 3 updates to address mostly IESG and IETF last call comments. It was on the January 25th IESG telechat. And at this point, all the IESG positions are either yes or no objection, meaning that it is procedurally ready to go to the RFC editor. It is now in AD follow-up state, making me wish we had our AD in the room. Do we know if Ecker will be? Okay, Ecker. So I want to revisit this for 30 seconds when we can ask Ecker about status. Yeah. There was one normative change made as the result of IESG feedback, and the remaining slides are to inform any of you who have taken a dependency on this draft of the normative change and the reasons for it. As you know, we use a well-known string, well-known /OAuth authorization server, as the location by default to publish the metadata. OpenID Connect Discovery had defined a string processing rule where you appended /.wellknown/ in that case, OpenID configuration, to the end of the issuer string. And so that's an example of what that would look like. It turns out that Adam Roach, one of the area directors in the applications area, pointed out that that actually violates URL policy, in that the only carve out for specifications to use the URL space is within well-known and with well-known at the top level. And so once he brought this up, I had like 4 or 5 area directors agreeing with his comment, his discuss, actually, and suggested that we instead insert well-known OAuth authorization server at the top level, and if there's a path, append it. This is not quite as easy, but it does work. Ironically, the nail in the coffin of this was there was a issue in the OpenID Connect tracker from 5 years ago that Nat filed and John discussed, where John in fact suggested, well, maybe we could do this, but the working group decided, no, that seems harder, so we didn't do it. But this change was made. It is a breaking normative change to the specification. And that's what it was going to take to get through the IESG. As I kind of just did verbally, the reason is you have to use well-known at the top, according to BCP 190 and the draft that established the well-known convention. So what is the impact of this change for implementations and developers? And there is a note paragraph in the draft now saying, note that this is different than the string processing rules for OpenID Connect discovery, and talking about this so that developers using the spec will be aware of it. But it means that OpenID Connect metadata documents are potentially at a different location from generic OAuth metadata documents, unless the issuer doesn't have a path component. If it's just a domain, it turns out that the 2 rules are equivalent, which is a common case. However, Microsoft has tenant IDs and others do as well. So this both occur. So as a result, if you have a service that's both an OpenID Connect identity provider and a generic OAuth provider, you may end up publishing metadata at 2 locations. If you are a client, which is both an OpenID relying party and a generic OAuth client in some sense, you may end up looking for the metadata in 2 locations. This was understood by the area directors and considered unfortunate, but they felt that the what was informally called the get off my lawn rules in Mark Nottingham's draft, which became BCP 190, superseded this. I will do that. Any questions on this before I retract 2 slides and ask the area director a question? No, this should be easy, just like what happened in the last OAuth meeting.
William Dennis, just with the comment, I think it all makes sense. And I guess the clients probably had to look in both locations anyway. Since
who are you?
William Dennis.
Thank you.
I did say my name, but I'm not sure if the mic's on. I think from a client implementation point of view, it looks fine because I think we'd have to look in both locations anyway due to the different name from OpenID Connect to OAuth. So I don't see any added complexity. Looks good.
Yeah, it's not hard. People writing code just have to be aware of it. And backing up, Eric, I wanted to touch base with you on this. We completed the telechat. All the positions are yes or no object. We're in 80 follow-up status. Does that mean that
I think it's my fault, and I'll see if I can clear right now.
that you can do what you did for token binding in the last OAuth meeting, except this time for OAuth, and grab the Shepherd review and press buttons?
If the follow-up, I think we're close to approval, so we just figure it out.
Okay. Thank you very much. That is all I had for that presentation.
Awesome.
Do you believe you addressed all the comments that people raised as well?
I do, and I responded to every area director on the appropriate thread and got no pushback. And Adam Roach, whose discuss was the main one, affirmed that this does the job.
Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Next presentation. Okay, so that was all good news. The JSON Web Token Best Current Practices document is another one that is on my plate. I'll say up front, what I'm not going to do here is re-review why this document exists, what the structure and goals of it are, etc. And that said, anybody can go to the floor and ask anything, but there is a presentation that covers all of that that was made at IETF 99 8 months ago, and there's a link to it there. So if any of you are not familiar with this document or why it exists, you can read it there. You can read the abstract and introduction, what have you. So the document status is that there is a 0.0 which was adopted by the working group based on an individual draft that Jeroen Scheffer had written in cooperation with Dick Hart and I, which did incorporate some working group feedback between 0.0 and 0.1 of the individual draft before it was adopted. There has been, except for one message from Brian Campbell, which I'll talk about in a minute, absolutely no activity on the list about this since July. And that was July during IETF 99 in Prague. The document expired in January. So Brian Campbell had sent a request for a clarification for one particular point. I have that tracked. I still need to apply this along with the other editors. I do plan to do that this week because it's a legitimate clarification. The more concerning thing to me is reviews were requested in Chicago, Prague, and Singapore, and they are not forthcoming. So I don't really know how to interpret this silence.
Typically two ways to interpret it. Either everyone thinks that it's done and is happy and has no further comment, or people don't care. I'm assuming the former.
Okay.
So what it was, this document was written out of the security issues that we ran into. So it's not, I don't think,
no, it does talk about
option,
some important things.
So there's not a don't care aspect. I think is not a realistic approach in my opinion.
And that may be. I mean, this is my last slide on this. I wanted to be conservative in what I said as the presenter. I think we do need to make an affirmative decision one way or another. If we're continuing this work, you could do a hum or whatever chairs do, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And if so, if we do proceed, we do need additional reviews. Those could come in the context of just asking for reviews. You could run a working group last call if your hypothesis is correct.
So what I think would be useful to do is...
I defer to the chairs. I am done with my presentation.
I think what would be useful to do is you published a document update, as you said, during this week, and we started a working group last call, and I would ask for some reviewers already now so we can get those in for the working group last call. So is there any one of you who would have some free cycles to look at this?
William raised his finger.
William Dennis, I just want to add a comment of support to this draft. I think it's extremely important. I've seen multiple mistakes made with JOTs that can be quite devastating. Whether it's just taking a system offline or worse. So definitely think it's needed, and hold me to the review. I'll try and get it done.
Okay, thank you, William.
And we'll also encourage the SAG, people on the SAG list or more crypto-minded people to look at this.
Sure.
But maybe I could have one additional reviewer. I think it's important for Tony.
And Nat sent a useful review early in the period. I don't know if you want to do it again. Okay.
That? Okay, perfect. Cool.
All right,
So
thank
that's
you. I think you have about 20 minutes back.
Awesome.
Thanks. Okay, I think we have a remote presenter.
Okay, how does that work?
Yeah. So, coming there, I think.
So normally
Yeah.
it's Stackman and
Yeah, Omer, can you join the queue there?
Yes.
Can you hear us?
To take over?
Yes. Can you join the queue or do you want to just present it from here?
Yeah.
Just present.
I can present.
Yeah, just present.
I'm just trying to figure out how I share my screen.
Are you able to share from your side, or do you want us to share?
Now, I'm trying to figure out how I'm sharing my screen. Oh,
We'll share it from here, Omer.
what?
We will share it from here, and you'll go over the slides, and you let us know when to continue and proceed,
Yeah.
right?
I did some changes to the slides. Okay,
Oh, okay.
never mind. We can go with that version. I did some changes on my chart, but it doesn't really matter. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Omer. I'm from Israel, working at Soluto. And today I want to propose a new OAuth 2.0 extension, a new standard. I'm calling it Seamless Flow. Okay. So I want to start with talking about why we need a new flow, why we need a new standard. When we started to work on our mobile application, we started to think about authentication. Usually, authentication on mobile application is done with login scan, with any kind of login scan. Either with authorization code or implicit flow or any kind of those combination. But apps don't always need or want login scan because login scan affect how the app looks and feel. And it will affect how many users will actually complete the onboarding flow and start using your app. So we understood that we need another solution, and we needed a solution that will allow to authenticate requests from the app without affecting the experience, without the need to add login scan. Now, you might be thinking about the draft called device flow, but device flow is not good enough because device flow still requires authentication, but the authentication is just done on a different device. What I need to do is I want to be able to authenticate a device without any user interaction. This will allow me to do device level authorization. For example, I can say this device is authorized to view data only from this device and not from other devices. On the other hand, I don't have any way to control who can register. Any device can register. So those are the two assumptions. In a very high-level overview, can you switch slide? Okay, so in a very, very high overview, the app is going to use JWS, JSON Web Signature, to authenticate. And the payload of the JWS is one-time password. It's kind of similar to JWT client assertion, but it's not the same. The main difference is the payload. In JWT client assertion, the assertion is done with the time, the expiration. But time can be tricky on mobile devices. We have a lot of devices which their internal clock is not synced. So using time is not something we could rely upon. Also, currently, I don't think to include the registration as part of the draft or the flow of how the device generates the matching public key and send it to the authorization server and the initial seed. Can you move 2 slides? Because the next one will, no, this one, sorry. This is how the authentication request will look like. You can see that We have the client assertion type here. I hope you can see it, and it will be JWS OTP, but maybe it will be changed. So it's very similar to JWT client assertion, but again, the main difference is in the payload. Can you skip the next slide? Yeah, okay, leave it. Sorry for this. Anyway, this is how we are doing the payload. Basically, to create the payload, what we have is I'm going to use two numbers, two long 64-byte signed numbers, and then you're going to use cryptorandom to generate the value of them. To generate one-time password, the device will roll. It starts with an initial seed, and it sends this seed to the server. So, for example, in this case, it starts with 5 and 2, and send this 5 and 2 to the server. And then, in order to perform an authentication request, it can roll. So, old will get the value of new, and new get new value, new cryptorandom. Change the names to be previous and next because I think it's better. So when the server receives the request, after validating the JWS, it can validate the payload, so it can check that the old came from the client is equal to the new stored on the server, and if they're equal, the request is valid. Can you move to the next slide? Okay, so this was the high-level overview of the protocol. I think it's a good time for questions. Basically, I have early version of the standard on GitHub, and I'm looking now for help with reviewing it and helping me making it quality enough to create the first draft, which I hope to send in the next few months. So if you have any questions, it's a good time.
Yeah, just one second. Go ahead.
John Bradley, Ubico. My first observation is that we have the JWT assertion flow, which enables you to do exactly this. So I'm not sure why you're inventing a new way of doing it with symmetric keys, which is probably more complicated and less secure. So I guess motivation would be a good thing to understand as to why the existing method that would let you do exactly this, which is used by Google and other people in various flows, why isn't that good enough?
Okay. I said it at first, but maybe it wasn't clear enough. The main issue I had with JWT client assertion is that the validation there is looking on the expiry field. So you usually have, I think, 5 minutes. It's JWT, which is valid for 5 minutes. And we have a lot of issues with mobile devices who their time is not synced. So, for example, they have like 1 hour or 1 day out of sync of time, and then they will not create valid JWT. So this is why I didn't want to use JWT, and I tried to find another way to create a one-time password as the JWS payload. I hope this answers your question.
Well, not really. I suspect that dealing with time issues, or there's implement. I'm not sure that in doing OTP is necessarily the way around it.
Justin Richer. I both agree and disagree with John, which is pretty normal. So one to the last point, I mean, it's up to you in your implementation and deployment what the expiration conditions and the acceptance conditions of the assertions in a job are. Yes, they are commonly time-based, but not necessarily. I mean, it depends on how you want it to do that. The other thing is that when I first looked at this, the thing that immediately jumped to my mind was actually not the assertion-based flows, but the client credentials flow, but perhaps using a client key-based assertion as the client authentication with this. Now, the authorization server, you say any device can register and it's device-level authorization and stuff like that. device level authorization already immediately tells me that we're probably talking about a client credentials flow. That's why it's there. But any device can register, and having this, symmetric key-based thing, or symmetric key or OTP, or it's all crypto nonsense. And I just got all the crypto nerds mad at me. But anyway, with this, you can basically use the assertions framework in the mode of the client authenticating to the token endpoint in a way that the authorization server can recognize, because fundamentally that's what client authentication is about. So the authorization server recognizes that this piece of software is allowed to make this call, right? That is fundamentally what needs to happen in that section. So to me, the application of the specs in that way would make more sense for this, as opposed to the straight assertions. Both are valid ways that we already have, though, and even given your qualms about expiries and things like that, I'm honestly not seeing what this does that what we have in existing specs doesn't allow for, or any ways that the existing specs could trip up what you're trying to do here. So I think we may be missing some very key component, because I understand what you're building and how you're doing it. I do believe I understand how this works.
I didn't want to get. I didn't want to go too deep into details because I didn't have a lot of time. But one of the key things that these protocols allows to do is to detect if someone was able to compromise the device private key. As the private key is the key the foundation of this protocol, if an hacker were able to compromise this private key, then this hacker will be able to create JWT and sign them. So we created a specific, unique one-time password protocol. You can move to this. Can you move to this slide? I think that the fourth one.
Slide number 4. He was slide number 4.
Two more, or another one. This one. So I didn't want to go too deep into details. I can do it now, but I'm not sure how much time I have. But the main thing this protocol allows us is to detect if someone was able to compromise the private key and impersonate the device. So this was the main reason not to use client credentials, because client credentials will not allow us to do that. And as I'm talking about mobile application, the scenario of someone else having your device and getting the private key from it is pretty reasonable. So I wanted to have a way to handle it.
This is Hannes. I guess what I believe we would need to do is to have you write down a little bit more on the motivation and some of those assumptions. I hear a couple of assumptions embedded in there. I think those would be very interesting to point out. And then as a secondary step, to actually look at what are the different solution approaches that we could look at and the pros and cons. We've heard a few of those here. Maybe they are applicable, maybe not, but it really depends on the first step, where we actually find out, like, what problem are we trying to solve? What are the security assumptions we have? Some of the assumptions that you just mentioned, I would have some comments on like the difference between the one-time password-based mechanism versus the public key-based approach, given that I was once the chair of the group that standardized the one-time password mechanism. But do you think you could do that? Write down maybe as an email or also as a draft update a little bit more about the motivation and some of the assumptions that you are making. I think this will help us to make some progress in that regard.
So
how does that sound, Omar?
I can tell you what I have right down, and we can take it offline. I think it will be easier. You can move to the last slide. I put some reference there. So there is already a blog post that describing all the assumptions I have and how these protocols different from existing protocols and the things I mentioned, especially the part of how it allows us to detect hacker compromising the private key. So let's keep this discussion offline, and I'll either write up a mail or any other way. Any more questions?
No, thanks a lot, Oman. That's very helpful.
Okay.
There's one question from William.
William Dennis, just with a point of order, are you planning to upload the draft to the IETF tools?
I want first to have some review and feedback before I'm sending a first draft. So it's already on GitHub. I put the link here, and I used the internet draft template that I forgot.
Yeah, that would be a real showstopper, to be honest. You have to upload the document. Actually, I didn't realize that you hadn't uploaded the document, to be honest, nor did my co-chair. Please upload the document ASAP, because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do any.
So I will send the draft soon, like when the tool will open again, and then we can continue the draft.
It is open already.
Okay, great. So I'll do it. I hope to do it this week, but no.
It's very fast. I can send you the link.
Yeah, I just want to close some things. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Omer. So we're gonna switch a little bit with the agenda. So Torsten, if you can start right now, and we want to take and also after that, sorry, Travis. After that, Travis, and the rest of the time will be used for that distributed discussion. Yes. I just uploaded the latest one into the. Did you download it from one? No.
Is it the version I sent you just
Yes.
before?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hi, I'm Torsten Norderstedt. I'm a VS.com. I'm going to present a new draft, and I will have a co-presenter, which is Mark. Maybe he's going to present one of the use cases. Can you please go to the next slide?
You have that. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, cool. So this new draft proposes an extension to the OAuth token introspection endpoint. So far, the OAuth token introspection endpoint only provides resource servers with token data in plain JSON format. And I came across use cases, and Mark came across use cases where it seems to be beneficially to have JOTs as the response in order to have a signed and potentially encrypted response. So, and that's what the RFC proposes. So instead of responding with the plain JSON object, responding with a JOT, which, for example, can be signed. So, what is it good for? First of all, as I said, it allows to sign the results and also to encrypt the results from the token endpoint. And this is something which is useful or is required in some situations where the resource server, for example, needs a cryptographic proof that this particular token was issued by a particular authorization server, mainly for liability non-repudiation scenarios. And also what data this AS has or had asserted in this particular access tokens. We're gonna elaborate more in detail in the use cases. This is just upfront a summary why we think it's useful to have this kind of signed and encrypted response. And there are other benefits from that. So in scenarios where there is an intermediary that fetches the access to the token data from the authorization server and then sends it downstream or upstream, depending on the perspective, to a resource server to actually use the access token to meet an access on or access control decision, it might be beneficially to encrypt the data in order to do not allow the intermediary to inspect the data. And in the same way, signing may preserve the authenticity and integrity of the token data. I would like to give some insight. Oh, sorry. Don't get a call all day, right? Just to give you an insight why we are working on this kind of stuff. In the last couple of months, I've been working in two areas and have tried to implement OAuth or adopt OAuth to the needs of two different areas. One is the financial area, the financial industry, and the other one is the area of the EIDAS directive. The EIDAS is a directive in the European Union that will bring interoperability into the EID space. That's one aspect. And the other aspect is it will allow to remotely create electronic signatures for real serious stuff. So for real legal documents, it replaces the handwriting more or less. And what I'm working on is a solution where verified identity data provided by banks or governments or such alike can be utilized by APIs that want to create this kind of remote signature. What it needs for this kind of signature are verified person data and a strong authentication. And what I have been working on is a design or designs where OAuth is used for the authentication authorization process and for carrying the person data to this remote electronic signature creation process. Why haven't I been doing? Because it's in all other areas. If you take a look on industries like the financial industry, or if you look into other communities, if they start to build APIs, they typically build into these APIs all the authentication and authorization stuff. We've seen that in a working group recently here at the IETF. We've seen that in the PSD2 space. So in the morning there was a discussion about the Berlin group, for example, and in the space of electronic signature, the same happens. There is a standard going on. It's called the Cloud Signature Consortium, and they more or less build the authorization stuff and the authentication stuff all into the API. And I tried to come up with a design that clearly separates authentication, authorization from the electronic signature creation step. And what I would like to achieve, and that this is really about implementing a product. This is not a theoretical academic exercise. We are going to build this product. And what we want to do is, let's assume there is a client, for example, an insurance company that wants that offers a customer with some product, and it wants the customer to electronically sign the contract. It wants to use, in order to enable this process, it uses an authorization server which is provided by, for example, a government agency, a bank, or any other entity that really is able to provide verified person data and is able to do a multi-factor authentication process to only make sure that this is really the person those data belong to. So in first step, the client obtains the access token, although the authorization server authenticates the person, asks for authorization to ship the data to the service that actually will create the signature, and hands back the access token. And then the client just calls the resource server with the access token and requests the creation of the electronic signature, which also involves the creation of a certificate. So first of all, the person data are used to create a certificate, and then the electronic signature is being created. So this is, you might observe, trivial. This is all standard OAuth. Nothing special, right? Except the data quality and so on. And Note the tricky part. The service provider that actually does the electronic signature creations, it's a so-called TSP, underlies a regulation. It has to comply to some legal regulations. So for example, it has to really keep an audit trail of the whole process. So how has the person been identified? How is the user being authenticated? Which data has been used for creating the certificate, and so on. Because in the case of a dispute, it's the liability of the TSP to really prove that everything went well. And here the problem arises. The RS needs an evidence that about the process that the AS performed for authenticating the user, actually for onboarding the user in the first step, which is the identification step, the authentication step performed during the transaction, and also that it gathered the consent of the user to actually initiate the transaction or the remote signature creation. And from my perspective, the simplest way is to just have an access token or an assertion that's digitally signed by the AS. One might say, okay, that's not a problem, use structured tokens, because structured tokens have this kind of digital signature. That's correct. The problem here lays in another fact. So what we want to achieve is that this client can access different services based on the same authorization grant. So for example, this AS might be an OpenID Connect OP as well, in which case the client wants to have an access token that can be used, or at least wants to have access tokens that could be used to obtain user data from the OP and to use that access token to create the remote signature. So what we want to achieve is we want to have a solution where the client can interact with different services while preserving audience restriction for security and privacy reasons. And that's why structured access tokens are, from my perspective, the second best option. I mean, we had a discussion about audience restriction, structured access token, I think back in Prague. Yeah. And Annabelle pointed out at that time, yeah, that might be a good idea, but you have to convince developers that it's also beneficially for them. And that's really not an easy task. And that's why I think introspection is the better way to go. I mean, in the end, it puts a burden on the RS, and it's not the best solution from a latency perspective. But for the use cases I'm aiming for, that's a good solution, because you relatively rarely sign an electronic document, right? So introspection would work, but in order to fulfill the objectives, we need to have an digital evidence of who created the token, what data are being asserted, and so on. And that's the reason why I more or less ended up with that solution. Yeah, I think it would be a good idea to have a job-based response on the token introspection endpoint, and yeah, that's how it would look like. Okay, and interestingly, on Monday, two guys approached me and said, yeah, the solution you're going to propose will solve our use cases as well, or our use case, and Mark will explain that in detail.
Briefly in detail.
Hi, I'm Mark. So actually, there was a message on the OAuth mailing list about introspection, returning a job, and doing that cleverly by using accept the response type. And when we saw that,
Can you stick to the mic, please?
oh, sorry, I'm trying to. When I saw that, it's like, yeah, we've done that, but we have a specific use case where we have done that, and we thought it would be interesting to do a write-up because that use case could be common in more scenarios, but it's a completely different use case from what Torsten is describing. I'd like to say it's we're trying to solve a performance issue actually, and a little bit of a user data protection issue. So we gave it a name, a phantom token, and the phantom token is actually making a statement saying that we have a by ref token, which is just the opaque access token that gets issued by the authorization server. And there is another representation of that token, which is in the form of a structured token, the JOT. And we want to be able to use the same grant or just the same authorization data in different circumstances. So the phantom token is about an app that's out in the open. The app requests an access token, which we call a handle token. There's no data in it. Once the app is ready to make a call to an API or to a backend, to a resource server, and it presents that token, there is an API gateway in the middle. Very often, that's what we see, and that gateway takes the responsibility of introspecting that token with the authorization server. So it gets returned a JOT carrying the exact same information, and the gateway can then use that to or can cache that information, so it only needs to make that request to the authorization server once, and pass on the JOT version of that token downstream to the APIs. So then the APIs don't need to do any introspection. They can verify the token contents and use that. Please go to.
You have the clicker.
Oh, I can do that. So this is what it looks like in a picture. On the left side, there is the app and the clients that set up the initial token request with the authorization server, making a request to the gateway. The handle token is represented with the white ticket, and on the right side, the same token is being represented with the slightly blue colored ticket, which says JOT if you look very closely, which carries all the information. So on the left side, there is nothing exposed. It's just the opaque data. And on the right side, which could be a more trusted part of the network, that's where the JOT goes around, and all the data that's in the JOT may be seen. Got the right button. So we saw Torsten's message. We saw the write-up that Torsten did to create something to start out with. This morning, we added some stuff to it, and now is the moment that we meet again and we get together and see what we all wrote up for this presentation. The status is there is a very rudimentary 00 version of it. We would like to add to that for sure the alignment of the HTTP stuff with the JOT stuff. Like JOT has some information about expiration, and we would like to convey that information in the HTTP response headers. So at the gateway level, the gateway doesn't need to know anything about JOTs, but it can work based on the HTTP headers. HTTP status codes. I think what more to do is to add the standard stuff there, as well as the security considerations. And we could be discussing some other topics, how to relate the AS from. Yeah, sure.
Since we are run out of time, I would like to make it really short. So one potential area where we could work on is that support scenarios where the RS relies on more than one AS. So the identifier-based token must somehow inform the RS which AS to talk to regarding the particular token. And there are other stuff to work on. I mean, what we want to achieve is we want to convince you to adopt this document as a working group item. That's why we're here today.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. So I think there's value in being able to convert, as you described it, a ByRef token to a by-value structured representation. Looking at it, though, and looking at your use case, it seems like that has very different security concerns versus the token introspection endpoint and the way that's typically used. And I'm wondering if it makes sense to overload introspection for both of these purposes.
Can you give more details on that? I mean, why you don't say it? From my perspective, it's rather straightforward.
Right. So I guess the question is, are you always going to want to let anyone who has this token convert it to the structured format, or are you going to need to be able to restrict access, or are you going to want to restrict access to that differently from how you might restrict access to the token introspection endpoint?
I don't see any difference to the text that it can be found in a token introspection spec. I mean, the AS may require RSs to authenticate towards the token introspection endpoint. We would use that to really, in the end, enforce audience restriction. Because if you don't know who's going to calling you, you don't know what the audience is that is associated with the callee. So yeah.
I'm gonna cut the line after Hannes. Okay. Oh. Okay.
we can sell tickets, right?
Hi,
After
Justin.
Dennis.
Justin Richer. So a couple of things here. One, and this has already been started on the list, but I think it's a discussion we need to have, and this is apropos to the presentation I gave the other day, is that we need to decide if signing the response using JWS as like an entire JWS element is the approach that we want to take versus other HTTP response signing things, some of which are just starting to kind of pop out here. This is more for his case as opposed to your case. Reading
would potentially be a solution. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a potential. It needs to be explored. I think that this group has a habit of throwing Jose at everything and hoping that that works for crypto. So, you know, it's something we need to be careful to consider. Now, one of my concerns.
May I react on that?
No, I don't think we have time.
Okay. So from my perspective, I would prefer to have it on the application level, not to really in the end.
Right, and I
put the transport more or less a copy of what's going to happen on the transport level in the audit trail. But that's my opinion.
Yeah, and I get that as an argument. It's sort of nice and self-contained and all of that. But that all actually leads me to a concern I have with the document, which Mark's presentation brought to fulfillment. And that's that the introspection endpoint doesn't return tokens.
Mm-hmm.
The introspection endpoint returns information about tokens. It does not return tokens.
Mm-hmm.
So treating the response as a token is a very off-label and a very disturbing use of this, especially when we have token exchange at the token endpoint, which goes back to what Annabelle was saying, to do something similar. Now, at its very base, token exchange is I give you an access token, tell you who I am, and you give me back a new access token. That's what it's supposed to be. I know it's got all of the other Microsoft WS garbage in there, but ignore that, and you can still chuck tokens in and out. Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah,
So
I mean, we need to have that discussion.
yeah, we need to have that discussion if that's a better
perfectly
thing.
fine. Yeah.
What worries me is like whether or not there's actually a solution for that, because if token exchange doesn't do what I just said, then token exchange is worthless. But having introspection return an actionable access token worries me, because that is really not what that was intended to do. And I would much rather have the design be such that when you're getting back an introspection response, what you're getting back is something that you consume directly, as opposed to something that you hand to somebody else.
I think that's a difference, but that's a difference between the two use cases.
Absolutely, yeah.
That's good that you pointed that out.
Token.
I mean, I was always about to say it's an assertion, not a token. I mean, and I think I did it at one point, because in my use case, it's shall be used directly to consume. I understand that.
Yeah,
guys,
it's the
we are
difference
short
between,
in time, please.
Yeah, it's the difference between locally consumed
We have an
assertion
interesting
versus
subject.
network
I
assertion.
know, but
This is
we have.
important.
Yeah, I know, but we have.
If you stop interrupting me, I can tell you that I'm done.
Sorry.
John Bradley. So some of the same concerns as Justin. I mean, token exchange probably solves the second use case. It may be overkill for Torsten's use case, where all you want is non-repudiation. I mean, once there's also proof of possession, which comes into play, etc. So I think some of the stuff that you're thinking about doing at the gateway, actually, once we start digging into it, may wind up looking a lot more like token exchange. And if token exchange isn't appropriate for people, then we probably need to understand that before we finish the spec.
Brian Campbell Ping. I'm actually not sure I have anything more to add in though, too, other than that to say the same things, that introspection is meant to inform the resource server about the content of the token. And your use case is around having that information have some signature over it so it can be stored away and be non-reputable, right? So that fits in with it. When you get into the API sort of gateway use case, that's a whole different use case, and that would then need to return a signed object that's actually targeted for whatever downstream service it is, and then you get into
the gateway and the end is declined.
It doesn't. It's either likely to break or not properly audience controlled or And that is in fact a use case that token exchange was specifically designed for. So I'm hearing that it doesn't work for that, but that was one of the fundamental use cases when I've presented. I've presented that exact diagram with different pictures.
One main difference is the integration on the HTTP level, which you can do when you use that accept type response header. So it's way easier to integrate instead of having to go up to above HTTP level where you have to do token exchange. So it's in optimization terms, there's something to say for going the proposed way.
Okay. I mean, so some of the other
let's follow up.
Some of the other things you were looking for, like expiry of the time of the token in the response,
Exactly.
are already there in the JSON. So I know it's one layer deep, but like a lot of those things have already been considered and built into token exchange. So I'll leave it at that.
So, dishonest, I think it's good that you, Thorsten, had a look at the response, and indeed, it would be nice to have sort of a digital signature mechanism covering it. I never thought that would be a token by itself, but I think that would be certainly useful to have, and maybe as part of the audit trail, because that issue didn't come up previously. That could be. I would look at whether there is a need to have additional metadata included. That would be useful for doing the audit trail, because the previous purpose for the claims in there, and that's why we had to reuse them, or why we wanted to reuse them, was really for the purpose of policy enforcement. And policy enforcement and audit trail are still a little bit different. So,
William Dennis. No comment from me on the SDS debate. I just had a comment on the API gateway. I thought it was just an interesting thing how using the BIREF one as a cache. One nice attribute of that is you can probably implement revocation quite nicely. One of the problems with a JOT is that it's generally good to expiry. It's sort of hard to revoke the JOT. I mean, you could have a revocation list, but it's generally complicated. One of the nice things about your little API gateway design is that you can potentially implement revocation nicely by just revoking the BIREF cache kind of entry.
The whole revocation thing of a JOT is still the same as it always was. So there's nothing optimized for that, or at least not that I know. No.
Okay, thank you guys. You got great feedback here from the team. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Travis, say 5 minutes.
All right. Hi, Travis Spencer from Curity. I'm also going to talk about an idea of a new flow, and this new flow is using post messages to
guys, make the discussion afterwards.
So this new flow is using the post message interface of HTML to help communicate to the application tokens in a simplified way. So what we found is that it's very, very hard for some developers to integrate with OAuth. I know that OAuth 2 was designed to make it easier than OAuth 1, but it can still be quite challenging for them with all the different query string parameters and the different endpoints and things like that. So in the flow that we're proposing, which we call the assisted token flow, it reduces the number of parameters to just one, which is the client ID, at least as the required, and gives a new endpoint so that it's not overloaded. And this will make it easier to write JavaScript-based libraries and to integrate it into the applications. And what we found is that this flow has to be done in the OAuth server, because doing it outside of the OAuth server ends up making an Uber client, which can be quite dangerous. So the way that the assisted token flow works, first of all, when the user is authenticated, a hidden iframe is opened up to the assisted.
A question for you. Did you submit a draft?
I sure did.
Did you?
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
So this has been submitted to the IETF tools on Sunday. So you make the request to the assisted token endpoint with at least the required parameter of client ID. And then if the user is already authenticated and has consented to this client, it will return HTML with a post message posting up the access token from the hidden iframe into the client. So it's a simple get. It's one query string parameter, and it's writing some JavaScript to handle the post message. So this is the authenticated state. Okay. The response looks like this, where this JavaScript is what is in the data. So it will have the success, it will have the access token, expiration, and some scopes. And then this is tied to the origin of the client who is allowed to frame this. And of course, we could have an ID token too if the AS is an OpenID provider. So if the user doesn't have a session, though, the client must be told so it can take action. And this needs to work when not just with OpenID Connect. So it needs to work without OpenID Connect in case the AS is not an OP. And the client cannot inspect the child frame. So that frame is completely off limits to us as the framer. And so how do we figure out if the user is authenticated? We have a timeout, which is terrible. We can use the prompt equals none from OpenID Connect. But we could also have a post message saying that authentication needs to happen so that the framer, the client, can catch that. And when it does that, so we make a request to the token and the assisted token endpoint, and we respond then with the post message saying, hey, you need to start authenticating. It can open up a new child window or a popover, and it can do that by returning this HTML that says authenticating needs to take place. And in the handler for that post message, it can display this window. So this could be done in the draft that we said, either in a popover or a pop-up. So if it's done using a pop-up, you'll see the address bar and things like that. What more do I say here? Basically that. So the client library then can catch that after authentication is done. It would respond in the same sort of fashion as before, where you have the access token available to you. So the assisted token endpoint, the only required input is the client ID, like I said a couple times, but you could also send a scope. So if you want to have different scopes, if the client allows for framing of more than one origin, it's going to need to provide a for origin to say to the AS which one wants to do the framing, because when using XFrame options, you can only have one origin in that. You could have other things around reuse, force authentication, freshness, like we have with OpenID Connect. So the for origin here, this will be required when there's multiple allowed framers, because as I said, this particular response header only allows for one. CSP allows for multiple origins. So in that case, even if you have configured multiple allowed framers, you could specify them all in the content security policy response header. But if you want to support XFrame options, then you'll need to specify that in for origins. This is also different from normal OAuth. If you don't request any scopes, you get all configured scopes. So this simplifies the developer's life, so they don't have to say, like, here's all of the scopes that I want. They just get the ones that are configured for the client. And if they want to reduce what's actually configured or change what's configured, they could include it in the request. But if they don't include any scopes, they get all of the ones that are configured. If there aren't any, of course, you get the default scope. So this makes it a lot easier for the requester, and it is in line with RC 6749 because we specify the scopes that are in the response that were actually granted. So that's the assisted token flow.
Thanks. Anybody has any quick comment on this?
John Bradley again. So we have to do something for single page applications. I completely agree with that. I know that Google and other people Breno did a draft looking at some of these issues. I know that there are some subtle and complicated issues with post message and security issues with people running other iframes on the same page and being able to sniff. So if the page that had the iframe had a third party JavaScript on it, that JavaScript could exfiltrate the access token.
Yeah, and we looked at that, John, and our conclusion is there's nothing that can be done. It's sort of like running a malicious module in your kernel. I mean, if you load a module in your kernel, it's
Yeah, but
it needs to be a good one.
convincing people not to put Google AdSense on their page is kind of hard.
Right.
So there are
So you might not
bunch
use
of
this
things.
flow for banking grade security,
Well,
even though it is actually exactly what they do for NemID in Denmark.
yeah,
by the way.
well, I mean, not all banking security is
It's
a
good security.
idea.
Yeah, but I understand. But I don't think there's I don't think there's anything that we can do about that case except for provide guidance and information about why you wouldn't want to do this in certain cases, and you need to trust the JavaScript that you're loading into your DOM.
All right, but I think that we need to look at this and potentially other. So we have to have, there's also with the other browser functionality that you have a draft on as well.
Yeah, I will respond to John.
No,
John,
Yeah.
one
So
thing that I'm wondering is, we had that conversation before, and I remember that someone said, "Oh, we should also do a BCP similar to the native apps one, but for
Right.
single-page application." Someone said, "Oh, I will sort of start something," and what
that
happened
person's
to
a
that?
liar. Bald-faced liar. So I mean, with all of the stuff going on, we just haven't gotten, the time and energy hasn't gotten to it. But
But it
now
seems that,
Travis is interested, perhaps we can actually put together some work to figure out what is the best way. This might turn out to be the best way, but it may be one of several possibilities.
Okay.
Or service workers is the other.
Yeah, service
mechanism.
workers won't help because whoever opens a service worker gets their own token, and if you open a service worker and you've already authenticated and consented, you're already in with the exact same token, just a different grant.
I'm going to cut the line after Nat. Sorry. Go ahead.
Nat Sakimura, NRI. Just a clarifying question. So when you're popping up or overlaying with the credential dialog, how do you indicate to the user that it is actually legit?
That it's legit?
Yeah, because,
I mean, in the popover, it's going to be hard, but in the popover, that's usually the AS and the client are run by the same organization. So they don't even see the difference or care about the difference. But when it's different organizations, that's when you would use a child window, and the indications to the user would be the address bar and the normal indications that the browser provides.
Everybody's going to be using web authentication.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. So just to respond to that, I think we have to remember, Nat, while you make a very good point that you do lose the context with a popover, that assumes that people pay attention to the context when it's a pop-up,
Yeah.
and they don't.
True.
So I think that we need to be realistic about what signals we can rely on with users, and single page apps that are going to be embedding iframes, as awful as they are, aren't going away. So having some guidance, I agree the BCP should be a thing. Whoever promised they'd write that and didn't should be flogged. And because we need something like that. And I think this is an interesting approach. Personally, I don't agree with the approach, but happy to chat more on the list about that. And
I think, thank you, Travis.
Thanks,
That was a very good starting point, and I think we should, will make sure that some work in the space happens. Travis, one of the reasons why we didn't see the document flying around is because when you submit a document, you need to have draft, your last name, and then followed by the working group name, because then it shows up in OAuth. Otherwise, it goes somewhere, right? No problem.
yeah, I will say that if you Google OAuth assisted token flow, it does pop up.
But yeah.
Brian?
Yeah.
Brian.
I always Google for these terms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Brian.
So. Okay, go ahead.
I'll try to keep it short. I'm going to talk about resource indicators for OAuth 2. This is A little bit of history here. This poorly named draft was introduced back in Buenos Aires at IETF 95. Some of you may remember that. Yeah, what was it? It was an attempt to introduce a new resource parameter. Actually, you could have more than one, but the idea was one resource parameter that was available as a URI, really a URL where the client intends to use the access token. And this was applicable on the authorization request to the authorization endpoint for access tokens that would be issued from there. So
Speak to the mic, right?
Sorry.
Yeah.
It was applicable on the authorization request for access tokens that would be returned directly from the authorization endpoint, implicit tokens, as well as applicable on the token request for access tokens that would be returned directly from the token endpoint. The way this is used sort of implies that the actual resource target where it was going to be used wasn't stored with the grant itself, but was something that was specified by the client in the moment of obtaining the token as information for the authorization server to use when issuing it. Why would we want to do this? It enables access token to be minted appropriate to the target resource where it's going to be used. And this could vary a bunch of things about the access token, like whether or not it's encrypted. The actual content or claims within the token might vary depending on where it's going to be used, whether it's a reference style or JWT token, perhaps different keys and algorithms in the JWT token case, suitable for different resource servers. It also facilitates audience restricting access tokens. The authorization server might take the value of that resource, that URL, as the value for audience directly, or more likely it might map it down into a more general, like to the host or to a tenant level path, and then use that as the audience. So this general concept has come and gone for a long time. Hannes wrote audience draft, I don't know, years and years ago. There was the concept of AUD in the POP key distribution that was in many respects very similar to this, at least conceptually. There's resource and audience request parameters in token exchange. And there's a number of proprietary variations of this that are all sort of conceptually similar that are out and deployed in the wild. The names are a little bit different. Some of the functionalities, not exactly this, but there's stuff like this that's being done now in proprietary fashions. And some might say, I think Hannes actually argued for this at one point, that this was an omission in the original OAuth2 authorization framework, at least from a conceptual perspective. There's no real way to say where the token is going to be used. A question that came up a lot is how does this relate to scope? I tried to break it down here and say that scope is really about what. What are you trying to do? What kind of access control is being requested? And this, in some deployments, gets overloaded to convey the location of the resource server, or oftentimes the location is implied via some sort of static setup of the components. But this isn't always feasible. There's cases like standard APIs like an OpenID Connect that define scopes that are purely functional and completely independent of the actual location of things. Resource here is really about where is the access token being requested going to be used, and this allows for a distinct treatment of that where from the what. So whatever became of this draft, this is my final slide in the Buenos Aires meeting, and one of the options here, sort of in the next steps, was we'll let it linger for a few years until the idea is resurrected in some other form. So a few years later, here we are. Actually, in Singapore, Dick presented this distributed OAuth draft, which is a little bit different, but I think you'll see sort of conceptually similar in the OAuth client credentials grant, the distributed OAuth profile. So there's a little, I had a little trouble reading it, but basically the client, when it makes a call to a protected resource, discovers the authorization server from the protected resource in the HTTP response, the 401 response. So when there's a www authenticate sent back, with it includes an issuer attribute in that response that points to the actual authorization server issuer. Although despite the name, it's the token endpoint, not the issuer. So it's a little confusing, but conceptually it's saying, here's the authorization server or servers I could trust. And then because this sort of resource server telling the client where to go get the access token, it opens up this sort of security issue of sort of phishing and pointing to malicious servers or polling for access tokens from legitimate servers so they can be used against other resources. So to prevent that, this host parameter was introduced in this draft to sort of serve a similar purpose to the resource, which is this host parameter is passed in the access token request and then used to basically become a host claim or attribute placed in the access token that would then be verified by the protected resource to ensure that it was in fact the original requester and target of the access token request. And I think very notably, this draft constrains all this to only use with the client credentials grant. I think just to try to simplify some of the things, and probably because that's the only use case that was in mind when I was having it. So this is really sort of the similarity piece, but it's all driven out by trying to secure this dynamic nature of discovery in the authorization server. And so, I don't know, sort of asked to talk about this here because it's all related. So what do we do now? And I honestly don't know. But I would ask that as we consider this, let's please not unduly constrain what are potentially useful and generally applicable functionality and concepts to something very narrow that we'll regret later, like very, very tightly constraining something about AS discovery and dynamic nature to only the client credentials grant.
So Mike, before you go on, so we have one more presentation around this same topic. So I'll let you go, you three go right now, but I'll cut the mic because I want Nat also to speak into this, okay? Go ahead.
This idea keeps coming up. I think this is an old idea whose time has come. We have a lot of evidence that people want this. I'll say that this exact syntax is used in production by Microsoft. That's not why I'm saying it's time. I'm saying there's a heck of a lot of evidence that people want this. So we should adopt this as a working group draft.
This is Hannes. For those of you who participate in the ACE working group, may have noticed that for there we use a proof possession based model, and as mentioned by Brian beforehand, we obviously had to have a parameter in place in the request when requesting an access token, because otherwise the authorization server doesn't necessarily know in all cases what key to use for use with specific resource servers. So we copied one of the parameters that we put into the document back then, and Ludwig should know better where it came from. But there we are using and registering, and the document is coming to an end in terms of standardization process. The good thing is we also registered it for use with not just with the use with co-op, but also of course with HTTP. So it would also be applicable to the OAuth itself. So I think it's a very good time to talk about this and to come up with uniform solution, one that doesn't just apply to proof of possession tokens, but also to other things, because I think fundamentally there's no necessary relationship between the two.
I'll just say that the work we have right now going on for proof of possession tokens doesn't actually require this sort of thing.
Proof of possession is
right. The work we have going on right now in OAuth doesn't require any kind of resourcing indicator for how we're doing it.
TorstenYes.com. I like the idea. For me, that's the road to audience restriction for structured access tokens. So I'm in favor of adopting the document, but I think we should clearly define or discuss the scope. For me, it's defined to narrow, because we need to talk about
Define to what?
narrow.
To narrow.
Narrow.
The resource indicator. I come to the other draft later on, because I'm still thinking that if you're going for audience restriction and structured access tokens, we should nevertheless consider the case where the same authorization grant covers access to more than one service. And then you have to somehow relate the resources and the scope values. There is anyway a relationship between, so you can't treat them completely independently. And then we also have to discuss how the client really determines the resource. This is all really fluffy in the OAuth space right now. So I'm totally in favor of adopting that, but we should think through that thoroughly. Regarding Dick's draft, what you pointed out reminds me on the discussion we had in Prague regarding do we use audience restriction or sender constrained access tokens for token leakage prevention. And I think we came up with a consensus.
To the mic. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to start it again. So what you said about Brian's Dick's draft reminded me on the discussion we had in Prague regarding token leakage prevention. There we discussed two different options, audience restriction or sender constrained access tokens. And I think the consensus was clear and is documented in the BCP. we go with standard constraint access tokens. So we don't need another solution for that. That's my perspective on that.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Brian. Nat, and Justin, this presentation, Nat's like yeah. So sorry, Brian, you had a comment. You wanted to say something. Sorry.
The only thing I was going to say is I wasn't necessarily advocating at this point for this to be adopted. I was just providing context and history around it, based on the recent discussions that are very similar.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Nat. And Justin, this is kind of related to this discussion, so you'll have a chance to.
Okay, so Nat Sakimura here from Number Research.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So this draft level auth response metadata is actually a very, very old draft, dating back to 2012. 6 years, I know. Is actually conceptually very similar to Dick's draft, except that the scope is actually wider. The Dick's draft target, as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, is the client credentials flow, while my draft is applicable for any flow. And Dick's draft enables the client to find out the location of the token endpoint and the scope that AES supports. Well, in my case, enables the client to find out the server metadata. Okay. My eyesight is too bad, so I can't read it. Okay, I'll do this. Okay, that's better. So the server metadata and the location of the authorization endpoints, token endpoints, the discovery endpoints, and it's a generic metadata framework. And when you look at the approach, it's actually very similar. We both uses 4.1 unauthorized error response and www authenticate header, which is defined in RFC 7235. The way the metadata is returned is different, though. In case of Dick's draft, it's returned as the extension to the www authenticate header, and it talks only about the token endpoint. While in my case, I'm actually leveraging on the RFC 5988 web link header. That way, in this case, it can only be used at the resource, but in the later case, it can also be used in any other endpoints as well. And the draft 08 actually doesn't have any anything to speak about the scope, but probably if we need to agree to do something like this, then we also have to talk about it as a target attribute in the web linking. Now, relationship to other documents, the Brian's draft is talking about request. Mine is talking about response. So it's orthogonal and complementary, I think. And I guess the Hannes earlier draft has actually been, Hannes' draft actually has been rolled up into the above. So, okay. So if we were to go forward, and I think it's a fair question to, think about whether we should try to merge them together in a single new work item, or I don't know.
Yeah,
so,
I to some extent, it's a great time to have this discussion, because I'm planning to send a mail to the list, because I fear parts of this conversation is already overtaken by events, in the sense that in the ACE working group, because there was the need to have a way to indicate on what resource server you're going to talk to, a parameter had to be defined. We just used one from one of the documents, and it's not just applicable for use with CoAP, it's also applicable for use with OAuth, with HTTP, sort of classical OAuth. So that may be an interesting. It may not be the scope that you want or other people want, but I think that would be a good conversation to have.
Yes, that
like
well.
what do we actually, how broad or narrow do we want to have it?
Yeah.
And that's
so that's one part of the conversation. The other part of the conversation is how to find out who's the authorization server, which is supported by the resource. My draft and Dick's draft, I understand, is more onto the later case.
Yeah, and Dick unfortunately is not here. So
That's okay.
yeah.
Annabelle.
Okay. So people, do you have any comment? Anybody has any comment? Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so this is mostly a comment on the last presentation, but they wouldn't let me get up then. I have a short comment on this too first, though, and that's that I think that this whole notion of handing the client where to go next is not only is it a really powerful one, it closes a lot of the security holes that we've seen in the wild over the last few years with having a single discovery document that can mix and match different services, especially when you're relying on replayed shared secrets, i.e. client credentials and things like that throughout your network. So I do think that that this is good, and retrospectively, I wish we would have done OAuth 2 like this to start with. So I'd like the chairs to consider maybe OAuth 3 at this point. We've got enough stuff bolted on to OAuth 2 that it's not really OAuth 2 anymore. That's for the chairs to consider over more alcohol. To the previous point, and this is also about bolting more things into OAuth. I agree with the point that was raised before about how we have to consider this resource indicator along with scope. I think we also have to think how it fits along with audience, because we're having multiple dimensions of ways to describe what am I trying to do. Right, because ultimately the idea with scope was we have one simple bucket to put everything of that means what is this token good for, and it turned out in the real world that a lot of people want more expressivity than what that allows in a reasonable fashion, and it's the real trouble comes not with just the listing, because you can obviously just put resource URLs as scopes, and that works today. You don't need an extension for that. The problem with that comes with the combination of all of these different things and managing those combinations. So explicitly creating multiple categories, reasonable idea, but the combination of those has to be very carefully prescribed in my view. Otherwise, we're going to end up with people who are interpreting a particular combination of scope, audience, and resource one way, and people interpreting the same combination in a different and incompatible way. So the client that thinks it's asking for one thing is actually asking for something else just because it's talking to a different AS. And that's not a world we want to live in.
William Dennis, I think this is a very valuable thing to have. And I like the idea that it's more generic than Dick's draft. I think we should have a generic expression for this. I think I was also supportive in 2016 when you presented it. So yeah, let's merge it. That would be my suggestion. So my support.
Annabelle Backman, Amazon. Couple of points, pretending to be Dick here. I think the driving factor for Dick's draft focusing on client credentials was just that's the use case. So I don't think there's any objection around expanding that to broader, more broadly than that. Likewise, is this one draft? Is it two drafts? One focusing on audience, one focusing on resource? I think that's immaterial as far as that's concerned. Let's just get it done. The other comment I wanted to make is when we talk about resource indicators, I think there's two very similar but importantly different use cases there. One is the wanting to be more specific about what is being asked for in this access token. Am I asking for scope XYZ for resource server A or scope XYZ for resource server B? That's one thing, as those are potentially the same scope but with different meanings. The other side is the security aspect of making sure that the access token, the authorization server is issuing an access token that's then going to be used with the right server and not with the not with a man-in-the-middle type of attack. Those are two very important use cases. They are also slightly different from one another. So we need to make sure that whatever solution we land on here, that we're supporting both of those.
Okay, I'm gonna cut the mic after John.
John Bradley. So, the two sort of address different sides of the issue. I was initially opposed to putting them together, but thinking about it, the security considerations around resource and audience restricting the tokens are so important to not shooting ourselves in the foot with client metadata. It's probably at least useful to start off with them as a single document. We may decide to split them up later, but working on them together would probably help us think through some of the security issues that we're creating for ourselves. I mean, one of the very early threats identified for OAuth 2 was, well, what if you let a resource to say where its authorization server is? Well, that immediately leads to bad resources, tricking a client to go to a bad resource and get a token that is going to be handed over, a bearer token that gets handed over to it, that it can then use it someplace else. So we have to think about all of these security issues very closely. And the resource indicator or whatever we do for that is a necessary piece before the discovery stuff would be safe to deploy. So I think tying them together, at least initially, probably makes sense.
Okay, thanks, John. So Hannes and I were kind of thinking this is a really interesting topic, and kind of maybe we were thinking maybe an interim meeting is needed for this. Would there be interest? What's that? Yeah. I'm talking about virtual. Sorry, just to be clear. Virtual we've done that. So would there be interest in that before Montreal? Yeah. Okay. We'll arrange for that. And that's all we have today. Thank you.
Okay, that's also okay for you.
Yeah. Good. Thank you.